The challenge tonight is how do we pay for green infrastructure in an age of austerity? And the question is, just tax more, or perhaps we should be spending more of our taxes on green infrastructure? It is a challenge, but parks and green space, which is where I have a particular passion and interest, not just the Olympic Park, but other areas of work, because I think that is a fundamental part of communities' well-being and quality of life in our increasing urban areas, that it is a public good and public benefit, and the public should pay for it, and we could just stop at that point. But we know it isn't as simple. And actually, if you look through history, the funding and models for paying for our urban fabric, our urban green space, our parks, our green infrastructure as we call it now, has always been mixed and varied, and it has always been a roller coaster. And I had an interesting commission that Paul made reference to, which is State of UK Public Parks, a report that perhaps a number of you have had the benefit of seeing and reading last summer, which is a stock take commissioned by the Heritage Lottery Fund, who have spent, with the big lottery fund, some £700 million restoring public parks for almost 2 decades, certainly since the start of the Urban Parks programme in 1996. And it brought out last summer some very salient points as a stock take, which had not been done across the UK for about 14 years since the Public Parks Assessment in 2000, highlighting some very good news in terms of parks and green space having improved significantly over certainly the last decade, but some real alarm bells. Authorities losing up to 30% of funding in the first 3 years from 2010, 2011 onwards. That percentage of funding lost for revenue, for upkeep of parks going forwards, potentially at the same level, on average 20-30%, it may be around the country, as this decade continues. Cumulatively, we could see the funding for the upkeep of our parks and green space falling by 50 or 60%. And if you look at local government association reports and projections, some of our discretionary services, our non-statutory services, including green infrastructure, could drop towards a 90% cost cutting by 2020. Those are the doomsday scenarios, but we are on that trajectory, and there are plenty of authorities that are trying to find 50% cuts as we speak. And so this is a challenge, and along with the Heritage Lottery Fund's research, they have teamed up with Big Lottery Fund as a joint funder with Nesta to undertake a rethinking process, as we are rethinking the urban landscape here. Nesta, with HLF and Big Lottery, have tried to look at developing new business models for funding parks and green spaces. And it was a research project, a fairly concise piece of work that I did before the State of UK Parks, looking at where those models are and trying to look at ways to fund our urban green space and our green infrastructure in a more mixed and more diverse manner going forwards. And it is about building new relationships with organisations beyond our public sector, beyond our central government, beyond local authorities, into communities, into businesses, into landowners, into utility companies, as this is a shared and joint agenda. But where do we look for lessons? Well, let's go to Tokyo, let's go to Japan. I had the benefit 2 summers ago to look at some of the parks briefly. And the lesson here is that Japan has been doing austerity since the early 90s, before I think Greece even knew who Angela Merkel was. Now, their challenge in Tokyo, where there is a real shortage of urban green space, has been to focus on quality and to understand how you manage places and spaces as carefully and in as a considered manner as possible. So the first point, I think, is worth stressing is about quality and not quantity when we are in austerity. and we can still do that, and we can focus our resources on that, although it is a challenge. I then jump to some flowering cherries, but these are in Liverpool rather than in Japan, because that relationship between parks and its hinterland and its communities, I think, has been fractured and lost over a century or more. And this is Prince's Park in Liverpool, Paxton project, but driven by a fellow called Richard Vaughan Yates, who was a developer establishing a park suburb or park district in Liverpool in the 1840s. And it was the project that Paxton practiced on before he went on across the Mersey to refine his art at Birkenhead. But this is a lovely story, not only that it is park making as part of the development process, and the government at the time was very keen to support local authorities engaging with developers to create landscapes of public good, but through the development process, that this is a park suburb where, with the initial foresight that Richard Vaughan Yates established a trust. He first tried to encourage Liverpool City Council to take the park on, but a trust that was established to run that park for some 75 years. And without knowing the full detailed story, it then in time moved across to Liverpool City Council. But it was funded through the relationship between development and landscape in its construction, but also in terms of its management and care through ground rents transferred because of the benefit of the prospect of the park and the property. So that relationship is important. And there is a couple of projects I'm going to talk about very briefly that are trying to explore that relationship anew to try and fund the management of our parks and green spaces. This is Bloomsbury, so we are here, just on this side of the slide. And it is a project commissioned by Camden Council as part of the Nesta Rethinking Parks programme, which I've had the benefit of working with Mark Walton and Lorraine Hart. Mark Walton of Shared Assets has been leading this to look at establishing a parks improvement district across Bloomsbury. How can you get those that benefit from the squares to perhaps contribute more collectively and collaboratively? And so at this point of time, we are looking at defining that district, drawing on a model that is familiar in the States and used to a certain degree here in terms of business improvement districts that also invest in the public realm. And this is looking possibly at setting a voluntary levy to start with, but potentially a compulsory levy through businesses to support the upkeep and care, but also the improvement of those squares so they can get better as time continues. The examples, I think, are greater in the States, and so another of my favourite parks is Brooklyn Bridge Park, which again forges that relationship between development and park making in an excellent manner. They draw on systems and tools that we only aspire to here, pilots, payment in lieu of taxes, where they can develop a proportion of the park and take the taxes that generate from that process to fund not only the construction but the management of the park, and also park increment recapture, taxation systems where you can capture the uplift that a park offers to development and land value and plough that back into the care and upkeep of parks. So it's a great model, and we wonder what that kind of looks like. Well, that's what it looks like. I like this slide. It was the presentation from the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board, and we can just pause and admire that 8% allocated for parks sitting there on the side. Now, the Minneapolis Parks and Recreation Board was established in 1884. It was at a time when we were building many of our great urban parks as part of our municipal park movement, and one wonders that if we had been able to establish this relationship with property and property taxes at that point of time, will we be having this debate now in the UK? And so I just played around with a bit of figures at the weekend. 8%. So London generates, in residential property tax, 2.7 billion in 2013-2014 in stamp duty on London's residential property. 2.7 billion. Now 8% of that, in my calculation, is 217 million. Now go to the DCLG website and you can find out how much it costs per local authority to manage open space on a year. And on that year, 2013-2014, all the London local authorities have spent 153 million on managing open space. So an 8% on stamp duty generates 217 million. We have 63 million profit, extra, surplus. So we could roll in the roll parks. We could put in Lee Valley Park Authority. And we would still have a surplus, probably 50 million, that would put into an endowment, because not every year is so good for stamp duty. And that endowment can grow, and that endowment can continue to fund the management, care, and investment in parks. So that is just a little flavour. Here is a small diagram that talks about that relationship between a range of different players that can help fund green infrastructure and the management of that green infrastructure in an age of austerity. I've talked about property owners, and I've looked at that relationship that we could potentially explore. But there are many other players, businesses, communities, non-government organisations, public agencies, and local authorities who are still central in this debate. And so perhaps those we can talk about another time, but I look forward to hearing what others have to say this evening.